What started as a routine promotional interview turned into television chaos when Margot Robbie stormed off Jimmy Kimmel's set after a confrontation that left audiences stunned and social media exploding with outrage. The studio lights were blazing hot that evening as Margot Robbie settled into the guest chair across from Jimmy Kimmel, her smile practiced but genuine. She'd done this dance countless times before. The promotional circuit, the carefully crafted anecdotes, the playful banter that kept audiences entertained. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Promote her latest film, share a few laughs, and head home. The audience was electric with anticipation, phones already recording in hopes of capturing a viral moment. Kimmel opened with his usual monologue energy, cracking jokes about Hollywood and current events before turning his attention to his A-list guest. "So Margot, you're here to talk about your new movie, but I have to ask, what's it like being one of the most photographed women in the world? I mean, the paparazzi follow you everywhere, right?" Robbie's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of discomfort crossing her features. "Well, Jimmy, it comes with the territory, I suppose, though I do try to maintain some privacy when I can." Privacy? Kimmel leaned forward with that predatory grin his critics had grown to despise. "Come on, you're in the public eye by choice. You can't have it both ways, taking the fame and the money, but then complaining when people want to see what you're up to?" The audience stirred uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted banter they'd expected. Robbie's publicist, watching from the wings, felt her stomach drop. She knew that tone in Kimmel's voice. He was hunting for something, and Margot was in his crosshairs. "I wouldn't say I'm complaining," Robbie replied carefully, her Australian accent becoming more pronounced as tension crept into her voice. "I'm grateful for my career, but I think everyone deserves basic respect and privacy, regardless of their profession." Kimmel chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Basic respect? That's rich coming from someone who built their career playing a plastic doll. The reference to her Barbie role landed like a slap, and several audience members audibly gasped. "I mean, let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. You're not exactly doing Shakespeare." The color drained from Robbie's face. In the control room, producers frantically gestured at each other, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the train wreck continue. The veteran actress had faced criticism before, but this felt different, more personal, more calculated. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you trying to say?" Robbie's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white as she gripped the arm of her chair. "I'm saying maybe we should be honest about Hollywood for once," Kimmel continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension in the room. "You make movies about toys and comic book characters, then act surprised when people don't take you seriously as an artist. You want respect? Maybe choose better projects." The audience was dead silent now, the energy in the room shifting from excitement to horror. Robbie's publicist started moving toward the stage, but security held her back. This was live television, and there was nowhere to hide. "Better projects?" Robbie's voice rose slightly. "Jimmy, I've produced films that have tackled serious social issues, worked with incredible directors, and yes, I've also made entertaining movies that bring joy to millions of people. I'm proud of all of it." "Sure, but let's not pretend Barbie is Citizen Kane," Kimmel shot back, his smugness reaching toxic levels. "Though I guess when you look like you do, the bar isn't set very high for actual talent, right?" The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several audience members stood up, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Robbie's face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but with rage. She'd endured years of comments about her appearance, fought to be taken seriously in an industry that often reduced women to their looks, and now she was being ambushed on national television by someone she'd considered a colleague. "Excuse me?" Her voice was dangerously quiet now. Kimmel seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down with the desperation of a drowning man. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Hollywood has always been about pretty faces first, talent second. At least you're honest about it. The sound technician in the booth looked at his colleague with wide eyes. They'd witnessed confrontations before, but never anything this brutal, this calculated. Kimmel wasn't just being inappropriate. He was being cruel, and everyone in the building could feel it. Robbie stood slowly, her hands trembling with barely contained fury. The cameras captured every micro-expression as she processed what had just happened to her on live television. Years of media training warred with her natural instinct to defend herself, to fight back against this unprovoked attack on her character and career. "Jimmy," she said, her voice carrying a warning that anyone with sense would have heeded, "I think you need to be very careful about what you say next." But Jimmy Kimmel, drunk on his own perceived power and the adrenaline of the moment, was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. He laughed, actually laughed, a sound so dismissive and condescending that it echoed through the studio, like a gunshot. "Oh, what? Are you going to lecture me about professionalism? That's hilarious coming from someone whose biggest achievement is making a billion-dollar toy commercial." His voice dripped with mockery as he leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying what he perceived as his dominance over the situation. The audience was now openly uncomfortable, with several people getting up to leave. The energy in the room had shifted from entertainment to witnessing something genuinely disturbing. In the control booth, the executive producer was screaming into his headset, but the cameras kept rolling. Robbie's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then something much more dangerous: cold, calculated anger. "You know what, Jimmy? I've sat here and listened to you insult my work, my intelligence, and my worth as a human being on national television. And for what? Some cheap laughs? To make yourself feel bigger?" "Hey, I'm just doing my job here," Kimmel replied, but his confidence was starting to waver as he realized the tide in the room had completely turned against him. "It's called entertainment. Maybe if you weren't so sensitive—" "Sensitive?" Robbie cut him off, her voice rising with righteous fury. "You call attacking someone's character and career on live television entertainment? This isn't comedy, Jimmy. This is bullying, and you're doing it because you think you can get away with it." The band members behind Kimmel's desk had stopped, pretending to look interested, and were openly staring at the disaster unfolding before them. The security team was getting nervous, unsure if they should intervene or let the confrontation play out. Kimmel, realizing he was losing control of the situation, made one final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. "You know what? You're right. I am bullying you. And you know why? Because you and every other pretty face in Hollywood need to be reminded that you're replaceable. There's a new blonde with a nice smile waiting in line behind you." The words hit like a physical blow. Robbie took a step back, her face going pale, then red, then pale again. The audience was now actively hostile toward Kimmel, with boos and angry shouts filling the studio. Someone in the back yelled, "That's enough!" But Kimmel was beyond hearing. "Reason? You think you're special because you got lucky with a few movies?" he continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "You're a product, Margot, a brand. And like all brands, you have an expiration date. So don't come on my show and lecture me about respect when you've never earned it." That was the moment. The exact second when Margot Robbie had heard enough, when years of similar treatment from powerful men in the industry crystallized into pure, unstoppable rage. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her microphone, and when she spoke, her voice carried the fury of every woman who had ever been diminished, dismissed, or degraded by men who thought their positions gave them the right to destroy others. "You want to know what I think about respect, Jimmy?" she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I think you're a coward who hides behind a desk and attacks people who can't fight back because you know deep down that you're mediocre. You're not funny, you're not clever, and you're certainly not entertaining. You're just cruel." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the technical crew had stopped what they were doing to watch. Kimmel's face had gone from smug to shocked. to something approaching panic as he realized he had pushed too far, gone too deep into territory from which there might be no return. But Margot Robbie wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, her posture radiating the kind of controlled fury that comes from years of swallowing similar insults in boardrooms and on sets. The cameras caught every detail as she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more menace than any scream could have managed. "You know what's really pathetic, Jimmy? You think tearing down successful women makes you powerful. But all it does is expose exactly how insecure and threatened you are." Her words cut through the studio like surgical instruments, precise and devastating. "I've worked with comedians who could destroy you with a single joke, and they would never stoop to what you've done here tonight." Kimmel's face was cycling through colors now, red with embarrassment, pale with growing realization of what he'd unleashed, then red again with defensive anger. His hands fumbled for his note cards, desperate for something scripted to hide behind. But they scattered to the floor like confetti. "Look, maybe we got a little heated here," he started, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted damage control. "Why don't we just take a breath and—" "No." The single word from Robbie hit like a thunderclap, stopping Kimmel mid-sentence. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to attack someone for 10 minutes, and then pretend it was all just getting a little heated. You made a choice to humiliate me on live television, and now you get to live with the consequences." The audience was completely silent now, some covering their mouths in shock, others holding up phones to capture what was clearly becoming a career-defining moment for both celebrities. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. Kimmel's producer was frantically signaling from offstage, drawing his finger across his throat in the universal sign to cut, but the host seemed frozen in his chair. He'd started this fire, and now it was consuming everything around him. "You want to talk about honesty?" Robbie continued, her Australian accent now sharp as a blade. "Let's be honest about what you really are. You're a middle-aged man who peaked 20 years ago, desperately clinging to relevance by attacking people who are more talented, more successful, and frankly, more respected than you'll ever be." Several audience members actually gasped at this direct hit. Kimmel's face went through another color change, settling on a sickly pale that made him look genuinely ill under the studio lights. "That's not... I mean, you can't just..." he stammered. But Robbie was relentless now. Years of pent-up frustration with Hollywood's boys' club pouring out in a torrent of righteous anger. "I can't what? Tell the truth? Like how your ratings have been sliding for years? Like how everyone in the industry knows you're more interested in settling personal scores than actually entertaining people?" She gestured to the audience, many of whom were nodding in agreement. "Look around, Jimmy. Look at their faces. This is what happens when you mistake cruelty for comedy." The band members behind Kimmel were openly cringing now, some looking at their instruments as if they wished they could disappear into them. The bassist actually put his head in his hands, unable to watch the destruction of his boss's reputation happening in real time. Kimmel tried to regain some composure, sitting up straighter and attempting his signature smirk. But it came across as more of a grimace. "You know what, Margot? You're right. I am honest. And honestly, you're overreacting to some light teasing. This is what happens on talk shows. If you can't handle it, maybe you should stick to your safe little movie sets." The words were intended as a final power play, one last attempt to regain control of the situation. Instead, they were gasoline on an already raging fire. Robbie's eyes flashed with something that looked almost dangerous, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Light teasing?" She let out a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Jimmy, I've been lightly teased by better bullies than you since I was 12 years old. The difference is, they were actually children. You're supposed to be a professional, but instead you're a pathetic excuse for a host who thinks attacking women makes him seem clever." The studio audience was starting to turn actively hostile toward Kimmel now. Someone in the back shouted, "Apologize," while others were booing openly. The sound of phones buzzing with notifications filled the air as social media exploded with real-time reactions to the confrontation. Kimmel's hands were shaking now as he reached for his coffee mug, desperate for something to do with his hands, but he knocked it over instead, sending liquid spreading across his desk and papers. The metaphor was too perfect. Everything was falling apart, and he was the one making it worse. "You know what the really sad part is?" Robbie continued, her voice now carrying a note of genuine pity that was somehow more devastating than her anger had been. "You could have been better than this. You had talent once, before you decided that being mean was easier than being funny. But now you're just another bitter man who tears down others because building himself up is too much work." The words hung in the air like a funeral dirge for Kimmel's career. Even his most loyal staff members were looking uncomfortable, some actively avoiding eye contact with their boss. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted from confrontational to genuinely sad, as if everyone present was witnessing the end of something that had once mattered. Kimmel made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margot, I think maybe we should just—" But she was already removing her microphone, the small action somehow carrying more finality than any dramatic gesture could have managed. The tiny wireless device came free with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Robbie held it for a moment, looking down at the small piece of technology that had broadcast her humiliation to millions of viewers, then placed it carefully on the armrest of her chair. The gesture was deliberate, controlled, and absolutely devastating in its quiet dignity. "You know what, Jimmy?" she said, her voice now carrying across the studio without amplification, forcing everyone to lean in to hear her final words. "I came here tonight to talk about a project I'm passionate about, to connect with fans, to do what we're supposed to do in this business, entertain people and make them feel good. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who thinks cruelty is a substitute for talent." She stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress with hands that were now perfectly steady. The transformation was remarkable, from victim to victor in the span of a few moments. Every eye in the studio was on her as she prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be her closing statement. "But here's the thing about bullies, Jimmy. They only have power if you let them. And I'm done letting people like you define my worth." She turned to face the audience directly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "To everyone watching at home who's ever been told they don't belong, who's been diminished or dismissed or made to feel small by someone who thinks their position gives them the right to hurt others, you are worth more than their opinion." The audience erupted. Not just applause, but cheers, standing ovation, people shouting their approval and support. Some were crying, others were holding up their phones, capturing a moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media. The energy in the room had completely flipped from toxic to triumphant. Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror, as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. His career wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated, and he had done it to himself on live television in front of millions of witnesses. Robbie walked toward the edge of the stage, her heels clicking authoritatively against the floor. But just before she reached the steps, she turned back one final time, her expression now almost serene in its confidence. "Oh, and Jimmy, the next time you want to attack someone for their choice of projects, maybe remember that my toy commercial made more money in its opening weekend than your show makes in a year." The audience roared with laughter and approval. "At least when I play with dolls, I'm getting paid a lot more than scale." With that final, perfectly delivered blow, Margot Robbie walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage and into television history. The cameras followed her every step as she moved with the grace and dignity of someone who had just won the most important battle of her career. Behind her, Kimmel finally managed to speak, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "We'll be right back after these messages," he croaked, but his words were lost in the chaos. Audience members were already streaming toward the exits, many stopping to take selfies and share their reactions to what they'd just witnessed. In the control room, executives were screaming into phones while lawyers were already being called. The show's social media accounts were exploding with notifications as clips of the confrontation spread across every platform. Within minutes, Margot wins was trending worldwide, while Jimmy Kimmel's name was being mentioned alongside words, "No celebrity ever wants to see toxic, unprofessional, and career over." The aftermath was swift and brutal. By the next morning, video clips of the confrontation had been viewed over 50 million times. Entertainment journalists who had been following the story live began publishing think pieces about power dynamics in late-night television and the treatment of women in Hollywood. Several major sponsors pulled their advertising from Kimmel's show within hours. More damaging than the immediate backlash was the pattern that quickly emerged. Other female celebrities began sharing their own stories of uncomfortable encounters with Kimmel, both on and off the air. What had seemed like an isolated incident revealed itself to be part of a larger problem that the industry could no longer ignore. Kimmel's attempt at damage control. A hastily written apology posted to social media at 3 a.m. only made things worse. The statement, which blamed a misunderstanding and claimed he had the utmost respect for Margot and all women in entertainment, was immediately torn apart by commentators who had watched the confrontation unfold in real time. Meanwhile, Margot Robbie's grace under fire had transformed her from victim to hero overnight. Her final speech to the audience was being quoted in graduation ceremonies and shared by advocacy groups. Directors who had never considered working with her were suddenly calling her representation, eager to be associated with someone who had shown such strength and dignity under attack. The confrontation had lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years. It marked the moment when audiences finally said enough to the toxic behavior that had been normalized in entertainment for far too long. And it established Margot Robbie not just as a talented actress, but as someone willing to stand up for herself and others when it mattered most. Jimmy Kimmel never fully recovered from that night. His show limped along for a few more months before being quietly canceled, his reputation in ruins and his career effectively over. But Margot Robbie? She walked away from that studio stronger than ever, having proven that sometimes the best response to a bully isn't to back down, it's to stand up and show the world exactly who they really are.